questions, which I will endeavor to put as plainly as possible, and which I am quite ready to believe, from my previous experience of you, that you will answer frankly on your side. I beg to inquire, in the first place, whether you admit or deny Mrs. Milroy's assertion that you have made yourself acquainted with particulars relating either to Miss Gwilt or to Miss Gwilt's reference, of which I am entirely ignorant. In the second place, if you admit the truth of Mrs. Milroy's statement, I request to know how you became acquainted with those particulars. Thirdly and lastly, I beg to ask you what the particulars are. If any special justification for putting these questions be needed, which, purely as a matter of courtesy toward yourself, I am willing to admit, I beg to remind you that the most precious charge in my house, the charge of my daughter, is confided to Miss Gwilt, and that Mrs. Milroy's statement places you, to all appearance, in the position of being competent to tell me whether that charge is properly bestowed or not. I have only to add that, as nothing has thus far occurred to justify me in entertaining the slightest suspicion either of my governess or her reference, I shall wait before I make any appeal to Miss Gwilt until I have received your answer, which I shall expect by return of post. Believe me, dear sir, faithfully yours, David Milroy. This transparently straightforward letter at once dissipated the confusion which had thus far existed in Allan's mind. He saw the snare in which he had been caught, though he was still necessarily at a loss to understand why it had been set for him, as he had not seen it yet. Mrs. Milroy had clearly placed him between two alternatives: the alternative of putting himself in the wrong by declining to answer her husband's questions, or the alternative of meanly sheltering his responsibility behind the responsibility of a woman, by acknowledging to the major's own face that the major's wife had deceived him. In this difficulty Allan acted as usual, without hesitation. His pledge to Mrs. Milroy to consider their correspondence private still bound him, disgracefully as she had abused it; and his resolution was as immovable as ever to let no earthly consideration tempt him into betraying Miss Gwilt. "I may have behaved like a fool," he thought, "but I won't break my word, and I won't be the means of turning that miserable woman adrift in the world again." He wrote to the major as artlessly and briefly as he had written to the major's wife. He declared his unwillingness to cause a friend and neighbor any disappointment if he could possibly help it. On this occasion he had no other choice. The questions the major asked him were questions which he could not consent to answer. He was not very clever at explaining himself, and he hoped he might be excused for putting it in that way and saying no more. Monday's post brought with it Major Milroy's rejoinder, and closed the correspondence. The Cottage, Thorpe Ambrose, Sunday. Sir, your refusal to answer my questions, unaccompanied as it is by even the shadow of an excuse for such a proceeding, can be interpreted but in one way. Besides being an implied acknowledgment of the correctness of Mrs. Milroy's statement, it is also an implied reflection on my governess's character. As an act of justice toward a lady who lives under the protection of my roof, and who has given me no reason whatever to distrust her, I shall now show our correspondence to Miss Gwilt, and I shall repeat to her the conversation which I had with Mrs. Milroy on the subject, in Mrs. Milroy's presence. One word more respecting the future relations between us, and I have done. My ideas on certain subjects are, I dare say, the ideas of an old-fashioned man. In my time we had a code of honor by which we regulated our actions. According to that code, if a man made private inquiries into a lady's affairs, without being either her husband, her father, or her brother, he subjected himself to the responsibility of justifying his conduct in the estimation of others, and, if he evaded that responsibility, he abdicated the position of a gentleman. It is quite possible that this antiquated way of thinking exists no longer, but it is too late for me at my time of life to adopt more modern views. I am scrupulously anxious, seeing that we live in a country and a time in which the only court of honor is a police court, to express myself with the utmost moderation of language upon this the last occasion that I shall have to communicate with you. Allow me, therefore, merely to remark that our ideas of the conduct which is becoming in a gentleman differ seriously, and permit me on this account to request that you will consider yourself for the future as a stranger to my family and to myself. Your obedient servant, David Milroy. The Monday morning on which his client received the major's letter was the blackest morning that had yet been marked in Pedgift's calendar. When Allan's first angry sense of the tone of contempt in which his friend and neighbor pronounced sentence on him had subsided, it left him sunk in a state of depression from which no efforts made by his traveling companion could rouse him for the rest of the day. Reverting naturally, now that his sentence of banishment had been pronounced, to his early intercourse with the cottage, his memory went back to Neelie more regretfully and more penitently than it had gone back to her yet. "If she had shut the door on me instead of her father," was the bitter reflection with which Allan now reviewed the past, "I shouldn't have had a word to say against it. I should have felt it served me right." The next day brought another letter, a welcome letter this time, from Mr. Brock. Allan had written to Somersetshire on the subject of refitting the yacht some days since. The letter had found the rector engaged, as he innocently supposed, in protecting his old pupil against the woman whom he had watched in London, and whom he now believed to have followed him back to his own home. Acting under the directions sent to her, Mrs. Oldershaw's housemaid had completed the mystification of Mr. Brock. She had tranquilized all further anxiety on the rector's part by giving him a written undertaking, in the character of Miss Gwilt, engaging never to approach Mr. Armadale, either personally or by letter. Firmly persuaded that he had won the victory at last, poor Mr. Brock answered Allan's note in the highest spirits, expressing some natural surprise at his leaving Thorpe Ambrose, but readily promising that the yacht should be refitted, and offering the hospitality of the rectory in the heartiest manner. This letter did wonders in raising Allan's spirits. It gave him a new interest to look to, entirely disassociated from his past life in Norfolk. He began to count the days that were still to pass before the return of his absent friend. It was then Tuesday, if Midwinter came back from his walking trip, as he had engaged to come back in a fortnight. Saturday would find him at Thorpe Ambrose. A note sent to meet the traveler might bring him to London the same night, and, if all went well, before another week was over they might be afloat together in the yacht. The next day passed, to Allan's relief, without bringing any letters. The spirits of Pedgift rose sympathetically with the spirits of his client. Toward dinner time he reverted to the mens sana in corpore sano of the ancients, and issued his orders to the head waiter more royally than ever. Thursday came, and brought the fatal postman with more news from Norfolk. A letter writer now stepped on the scene, who had not appeared there yet, and the total overthrow of all Allan's plans for a visit to Somersetshire was accomplished on the spot. Pedgift Junior happened that morning to be the first at the breakfast table. When Allan came in, he relapsed into his professional manner, and offered a letter to his patron with a bow performed in dreary silence. "For me?" inquired Allan, shrinking instinctively from a new correspondent. "For you, sir, from my father," replied Pedgift, "enclosed in one to myself. Perhaps you will allow me to suggest, by way of preparing you for something a little unpleasant, that we shall want a particularly good dinner to-day, and, if they're not performing any modern German music to-night, I think we should do well to finish the evening melodiously at the opera." "Something wrong at Thorpe Ambrose?" asked Allan. "Yes, Mr. Armadale, something wrong at Thorpe Ambrose." Allan sat down resignedly and opened the letter. "Private and confidential. High Street, Thorpe Ambrose, 17th July, 1851. "Dear Sir, I cannot reconcile it with my sense of duty to your interests to leave you any longer in ignorance of reports current in this town and its neighborhood, which, I regret to say, are reports affecting yourself. The first intimation of anything unpleasant reached me on Monday last. It was widely rumored in the town that something had gone wrong at Major Milroy's with the new governess, and that Mr. Armadale was mixed up in it. I paid no heed to this, believing it to be one of the many trumpery pieces of scandal perpetually set going here, and as necessary as the air they breathed to the comfort of the inhabitants of this highly respectable